9 a.m. sharp. The courtroom was already packed. Front and center sat Simone Hayes, 35, mother of two and a trauma nurse. Her dark scrubs still creased from a grueling night shift. Her curly hair was pulled back into a messy bun, hospital ID still clipped at her waist, and her sneakers worn thin from pacing emergency hallways. No time to change, no time to rest. She'd come straight from resuscitating patients to fighting for her children. Today's hearing wasn't routine. It was to settle shared custody, and her ex had shown up with a new lawyer and a new story, painting her as too exhausted, too emotional, too absent to parent. Simone had brought evidence. She had statements from doctors, shift reports, childcare logs, but she hadn't expected the look Judge Lenora Barris, 63, gave her. Sharp black robe, silver-gray bun, strict posture. The judge's gaze lifted from the bench and landed squarely on Simone's uniform. "Miss Hayes," the judge said crisply, "are you under the impression this is your workplace?" Simone sat up straighter. "No, Your Honor. I finished a shift and came directly—" "This is not a nurse's lounge," Judge Barris interrupted, voice clipped. "You are expected to present yourself appropriately in court." A quiet murmur drifted through the gallery. Simone's attorney opened his mouth, but the judge raised a palm to silence him. "You're petitioning for custody of minor children," she continued, "and you walk in wearing what amounts to sleepwear." Simone didn't look away. She didn't shrink. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm, clear, unshaken. "With all due respect, ma'am, this uniform still has someone else's blood on it." The courtroom stilled. "It's from a boy, 7 years old. We lost his pulse at 4:17 this morning. I worked 3 rounds of compressions and brought him back. That's why I didn't have time to change. I had time to save him, or I had time to dress up for you." Silence fell like glass shattering, the kind you can't sweep away. Judge Barris parted her lips, but no sound followed. The truth had entered the room, in sneakers, in scrubs, in the voice of a black woman who refused to apologize for saving lives. You could hear every tick of the fluorescent hum above. From the bench, Judge Barris stared down, her jaw tight. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone wearing polyester and old Nikes. But Simone's posture held firm. The marks on her hands, tape from IVs, faded ink from trauma notes, spoke louder than words. Her attorney looked over, stunned. The gallery didn't move. A clerk leaned forward. A man near the back raised his phone. Judge Barris inhaled sharply. "This is not the place for theatrics." Simone gave a small nod. Not sarcastic, just honest. "I agree, Your Honor. This is a courtroom, and I respect it enough to show up when I said I would, even if I hadn't changed out of what I wore to keep someone else's child alive." The gavel came down once. Hard. "Let's proceed." But outside, the moment had already escaped. Someone posted the clip with the caption, "Judge tries to shame nurse for scrubs." Her answer? Unshakable. By the time lunch was called, the video had 600,000 views. By 2 p.m., it had passed 5 million. Simone's voice echoed across TikTok and Twitter. "Save a child, or change for you?" I chose the child. By 3:35 p.m., hashtags like #LetHerWearScrubs and #NurseJustice were trending nationwide. Local affiliates had already picked up the story. By dinner, primetime anchors were running the clip across every major network. But inside that courtroom, Simone Hayes wasn't thinking about viral views. She was watching the wall clock tick closer to 4 o'clock. Because after court, she had to pick up her daughter from school, in the same clothes she'd worn to fight death hours ago. And those scrubs? They weren't just stitched with hospital-grade polyester anymore. They carried proof of sacrifice, of duty, of motherhood. When Simone next stood to speak, the room wouldn't fall silent from shock. It would fall silent out of respect. The opposing counsel, Leon Grant, rose from his seat. Designer suit, custom tie, cufflinks polished like small mirrors. He approached the podium with the slow confidence of someone used to winning. "Miss Hayes," he said with a polite edge, "is it true you voluntarily chose to work an overnight shift before today's hearing?" Simone answered calmly. "Yes, I did. Even knowing this was a child custody hearing?" "Yes," she replied again, steady. "So would it be fair to say that you chose your work over preparing for this case? Over your children?" A breath caught somewhere in the back of the gallery. It rippled forward. Simone didn't flinch. She leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on her knees. "No, sir. I chose to stay with a stranger's child who was dying on my table. Because if that had been my daughter coding at 4 a.m., I'd pray someone else would stay too." Her voice never broke. I didn't abandon my children. I showed up in the way I'd want someone to show up for them. Even Leon hesitated, words briefly suspended mid-air. But Simone wasn't finished. And just for the record, she added, voice low, these night shifts, they pay our rent, they cover groceries, they pay for my daughter's speech therapy after her father left without warning. These scrubs don't scream wealth, but they mean survival. A whisper passed through the seats behind her. One woman blinked away tears, another pressed a tissue to her mouth. Judge Barris had her hand on the gavel, but she didn't bring it down. She just stared, watching. Leon cleared his throat. It's clear you're emotionally overwhelmed. I'm not overwhelmed, Simone said, gently cutting in. I'm exhausted, and those aren't the same thing. One is weakness. The other is what happens when you carry a family on your back while strangers call you unfit because your shirt isn't pressed. And just like that, the balance in the room shifted. Not a legal ruling, not yet, but the energy cracked. Because in a place designed to value order, evidence, and optics, someone had just reminded the room what strength actually looked like. It looked like wrinkled scrubs, 2-day-old mascara, and a mother who never once apologized for showing up real. The silence afterward was heavy, the kind that makes you adjust in your seat, unsure where justice really stands. Leon Grant returned to his table, flipping through his files like they suddenly meant nothing. Judge Barris finally spoke. Recess, she said, her voice thin. The bailiff moved to open the doors, but before anyone could rise, Simone's attorney stood up. Your Honor, before we break, may I call our witness? The judge sighed. Go ahead. The courtroom doors opened, and in walked Dr. Leah Morales, Chief of Emergency Medicine at St. Joseph's Regional, early 50s, commanding. White coat worn over charcoal slacks and heels that didn't falter. She headed straight to the stand. No papers. No delay. Simone looked up, caught off guard, eyes wide. She hadn't known her chief was coming. When Dr. Leah Morales raised her right hand and took the stand, Simone Hayes felt her breath catch. The chief locked eyes with the bench. I'm here to correct a misperception, she said, voice composed but firm. It appears this courtroom mistook my nurse's uniform for laziness. Or worse, disrespect. A hush swept the gallery. Judge Barris sat up straighter. Simone Hayes is the nurse I summon when the new grads panic. She's the one holding the hands of fading children while their parents rush from parking garages. She's the reason half our ER staff stayed fed last spring. She skipped 26 lunches so they didn't have to. Morales shifted her weight slightly, then faced the judge. She didn't wear scrubs to make a statement. She wore them because she stayed with a child who stopped breathing. Then ran here, not to rest, but to fight for her own kids. And then, voice unwavering, she delivered the line that carved silence into marble. If that's what this courtroom calls disrespect, I suggest every robe in this building spend one Friday night in a trauma bay. Even the court reporter paused her typing. Judge Barris blinked slowly. Dr. Morales unfolded a slip of paper from her pocket. Your Honor, she said, I'd like to submit a letter. She handed it to the clerk. It was written by the parents of the child Simone saved this morning. They wrote it right there in the waiting room. The clerk read the note silently. It was only 4 lines. To whom it may concern. If Simone Hayes had gone home instead of staying, our son wouldn't be alive. Give her children back. She's already earned them 100 times. Across the gallery, someone wiped their eyes. Others didn't bother hiding their tears. The judge didn't move, didn't speak, but something behind her eyes shifted. Like a crack had formed in the marble she wore like armor. Simone was still in her seat. She dabbed her face gently, not out of defeat, but because someone finally said aloud what she'd never found the words for. And in that moment, the courtroom didn't just pause. It transformed. Lunch recess was called, but no one left debating custody or law. They were whispering about her. The nurse in scuffed sneakers, who showed the world what grace looked like under fire. By 12:45, a crowd had gathered outside the courthouse. Nurses, EMTs, 2 firefighters in full gear. The story had traveled. On Fox, a headline read, "The Scrubs That Shook the Country." CNN ran, "Nurse silenced in courtroom speaks loudest of all." Simone's words weren't trending because she shouted. They caught fire because they were true. Inside, Judge Barris sat alone, rereading the transcript. Not as a judge, as a mother. And it hit hard, because she'd never had to choose between saving someone else's child and defending her own. Simone had done both, in the same shift. Down the hall, Simone sat on a wooden bench, peeling a granola bar halfway open, her lawyer Matt beside her. "You okay?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "I'm not trying to be anyone's symbol." Matt glanced over. "You're not. Symbols sit still. You moved." A faint smile touched her lips. "Truth's not clean." Matt shrugged. "Neither are scrubs." Farther down the hall, a young court clerk approached slowly, almost shy. "Ma'am, my mother's a nurse," she said quietly. "Just wanted to thank you for not changing. Not for them, not for anyone." Simone didn't give a speech. She didn't need to. She placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder and said, "Then your mom's the hero." Because a woman in worn-down sneakers had walked into her courtroom and redefined what honor looks like. Judge Barris sat tall on the bench, robe draped, posture immaculate. But she didn't feel above anyone. For the first time that day, she felt visible. Not to Simone, not to the gallery, to the truth, now standing in front of her, uninvited but undeniable. She cleared her throat. "Before we proceed to closing arguments, the court has reviewed all documentation, and this morning's full testimony." Her gaze found Simone. "You said something earlier, that you didn't choose between your job and your children. You chose to be the kind of mother who'd show up, if her child ever needed saving." The gallery didn't shift. No one dared breathe. "That line stayed with me," Judge Barris said. "This courtroom values decorum, but I failed to realize that real decorum isn't about pressed collars. It's about showing up when no one's looking, sacrificing quietly, without applause." She turned to the court reporter. "Strike all previous commentary about Ms. Hayes' attire from the record. Permanently." The room rustled. Whispers passed from row to row, but the judge wasn't finished. "This courtroom has heard its share of well-dressed liars, of fraud wrapped in silk and arrogance. But today, we watched a woman walk in after saving a life, and get scolded for not changing clothes." She looked Simone directly in the eyes. "Ms. Hayes, I owe you something greater than an apology. I owe you gratitude." One by one, the gallery began to rise. First, a nurse at the far end, then the court clerk. Then the crowd, every spectator, paralegal, opposing counsel, even the bailiff, all stood in silence, heads bowed. Simone stayed still for a moment. Then slowly, quietly, she stood too, but not for herself. She stood with them. Judge Barris's voice faltered for the first time all day, just barely, but it cracked. "Let the record reflect," she said softly, "that strength does not always wear a suit. Sometimes it wears scrubs, walks in late, and still holds the world together." And in that moment, the courtroom was no longer about rules or roles. Not robes, not titles. It was held together by a woman who didn't yell, didn't demand, didn't fight. She simply showed up, worn down, covered in someone else's blood. And that was enough to make even the gavel drop its pride. The courtroom remained standing long after Simone sat down again. The nurses along the walls held their line like quiet sentinels. Even the bailiff, usually stone-faced, stood taller, like something inside him remembered what justice was meant to protect. Judge Barris turned to the attorneys. "We may proceed with closing arguments." Simone's lawyer, Matt, stood slowly. "Your Honor," he said, voice steady, eyes locked on the bench. "I believe my client. She already gave her statement," Matt said quietly, rising to his feet. "Not in words, in action, through her chief's testimony, through that letter from the boy's family, through the way this room responded to what none of us had the courage to say." He looked toward Simone and sat down. Across the aisle, opposing counsel Leon Grant remained standing, unmoving. His eyes scanned Simone again. Wrinkled scrubs, tired face, hair unkempt but eyes sharp. Something inside him shifted. The arrogance was gone. His voice softened. "I withdraw my closing argument." A ripple of gasps swept the room. Then silence. Grant turned to the gallery, then back to the judge. "I've represented dozens of custody cases, but this is the first one that made me question myself. Miss Hayes, I was wrong." Simone didn't respond. No nod, no words. She didn't cry. She was too far past tears. This wasn't TV. It was real. And for the first time in what felt like years, she wasn't defending her life. She was watching it be understood. Judge Barris folded her hands. "I've reached a ruling." The room held its breath. "Full physical and legal custody shall remain with Ms. Simone Hayes. There is no legal, moral, or emotional evidence that her children would be better served elsewhere." The air shifted. "This court recognizes not only Ms. Hayes' sacrifices," the judge continued, "but her unwavering stability, her consistency, and her strength. Simone closed her eyes. Not from dramatics, from release. Her messy, exhausted, unfiltered life wasn't just enough. It was right. Judge Barris continued, her voice gentler now. This courtroom thanks Ms. Hayes for reminding us. True justice must protect those who keep showing up, even when they're running on fumes. Nobody clapped. Not yet. Everyone waited. And then Judge Barris added one final line. Let it be known, from this day forward, any nurse appearing in this courtroom after a shift will be offered water, not warnings. That's when it happened. A clap from the back, then another, and then the room, all of it, stood and filled with thunder. Not for a verdict, not for a win, for a woman who hadn't changed clothes, because she'd been too busy saving someone's life. The applause in courtroom 3C lasted more than a minute. No gavel interrupted. No bailiff stepped forward. Even Judge Barris leaned back and let the sound wash over the room, like rain after a long, long dry season. Simone Hayes stood still, not basking, not emotional, just there, exactly the way she always was, in trauma bays, in courtrooms, beside her daughter's bed at night, watching her breathe while strangers questioned her worth. When court finally adjourned, a wall of people waited outside. Flashbulbs, microphones, voices calling her name. Simone didn't stop. She walked past them in scrubs, in sneakers, the way she came in, and wrapped her arms around her two children waiting on the courthouse steps. Is it over? Her daughter whispered. Simone smiled. No, sweetheart. This is where it starts. That night, her story ran on every major network, not as a scandal, not as a legal shockwave, but as a reminder of what it looks like to show up tired, to protect what matters, to prove your worth without ever needing to raise your voice. Headlines poured in. ABC. Judge humbled by exhausted nurse's truth. NBC. ER scrubs, sacred ground, one mother's stand. Daily Mail. Nurse shamed for uniform leaves court in applause. Hashtags climbed again. Simone Hayes. Respect the scrubs. Nurses stand tall. And across hospitals nationwide, a movement quietly bloomed. Scrubs Day, where every nurse wore their uniform with pride. From rural clinics to big city hospitals, nurses stepped into their shifts wearing their scrubs just a little taller. A t-shirt started circulating online with Simone's quote in bold print. I didn't change. I showed up. A national anchor tried to read it on air, but had to pause midway through, voice catching. Simone didn't see it. She was in her kitchen, rinsing dishes, helping her daughter with spelling words, warming up soup and folding socks. The knock came just after 7 p.m. A neighbor held out a manila envelope full of headlines. You're everywhere, she said. Simone smiled gently. I don't need to be everywhere, she said. I just want to be there when it matters. That night, as the porch light flickered on and the block fell quiet, her daughter asked, Will people remember? Simone wrapped her in an arm and replied, They might not remember my name, but they'll remember what we proved. That strength doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stay. On the other side of town, shift alarms buzzed in early, and across the country, a quiet force of nurses set out their uniforms, not for recognition, but for readiness. 3 weeks later, Simone's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. Ms. Hayes, said the voice. This is the American Service and Labor Museum. We'd like to request your courtroom scrubs for a national exhibit. Simone blinked. My scrubs? Yes, ma'am. We'd like them placed next to the wildland firefighter gear from Oregon and the steelworker boots from the Great Lakes strike. Because what you did wasn't just personal. It reminded us who's been holding this country up, quietly. Simone walked to the drawer, pulled them out, still folded, still carrying the creases of that morning, still shadowed by dried code blue ink. They weren't just part of a story. They were part of a turning point. She sealed the package and mailed it in silence. The exhibit unveiled weeks later, a case of worn fabric with a placard that read, The Scrubs That Stayed, worn by Simone Hayes, ER nurse. After a night shift, she stood before a judge and reminded the nation that dignity doesn't depend on polish. It lives in presence. Teachers brought students to see it. A high school in Ohio built a leadership module around it called Standing Without Permission. Letters followed. Hundreds, nurses, teenagers, social workers, single dads. One came from a judge, handwritten. I used to think appearance was everything. You reminded me. Sacrifice speaks louder. Still, Simone didn't change her rhythm. She clocked in. She kissed scraped knees. She tucked her daughter in with one hand still stained from a marker chart. Until one morning, her daughter ran in, waving a school flyer. "They're naming a day after you," she shouted. Simone laughed. It read, Simone Hayes Day, officially recognized on Nurses' Day. She poured orange juice and said, "No, baby, they didn't name it after me. They named it after people who stay when it's hardest. People who don't wait to be applauded, just to be needed." Her daughter grinned and ran off toward the door. That afternoon, bells rang in hospital wings from Baton Rouge to Buffalo. And in courtrooms that once scolded tired uniforms, something shifted. Now, when a judge looked up and saw blue scrubs, they remembered someone who didn't walk in to be seen. She walked in because someone had to. Because Simone Hayes never asked to make history. She was just too steady to disappear, too real to adjust, and too loyal to the ones she loved to ever leave their side, whether they needed a nurse or a mother who always, always showed up.